I'm so happy that the Lions Club agreed to have us join them tonight so that we could have Justin Martin come to tell us about his book. Those of us who have read it think it's really a good story told another kind of a different way. Justin lives in New York. He drove down today. He's going to stay in Sharpsburg. He's more familiar with Sharpsburg, I think, than some residents might be. He's done his homework. I don't like to give long introductions because you're not here to hear introductions. You're here to hear what Justin has to say. He has books that you may take home with you if you really love. Justin Martin.
Well, thanks for that very nice introduction, Vernell, and it's an honor to be here speaking for the Lions Club and also before the Sharpsburg Historical Society. And it's also great to be back here in Sharpsburg. I actually came here a number of times in the course of doing my research and for the book, and it was just it was a privilege and an honor to get a number of tours from the tour guides at the Antietam National Battlefield. That really helped me with my research, helped bring the topic to life. And my book is called Fierce Glory, and I've been a number of places doing book talks, places like Kansas City and New York City, and invariably I have to start with this slide. I'm going to have to orient people to Sharpsburg. That is your town. You may well be familiar with this particular classic image, but that is your town about the time, contemporaneous to the battle. At that point, Sharpsburg was 99 years old, dated to colonial Maryland, and had about 1,000 people at the time of the battle. So Antietam, of course, was September 17th of 1862, and what precipitated the battle was the first ever Confederate invasion of the Union territory. This was during the first week of September of 1862, and the Confederates at that point, they crossed across the Potomac from what was then Virginia into Maryland, and they had a number of different notions in mind of what they hoped to accomplish. One of the things they hoped to do was actually to disrupt the Union midterm elections. Then as now, midterm elections were a big deal. There was no accident that they did the invasion in September. The midterms at that point were less than 2 months away. And the thought was the Union was in the midst of a terrible losing streak. And the northern citizenry, they were kind of growing weary of the war. At this point, the composition of the government, the federal government was, for the Union, was you had Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, as the president, and you had a Republican, both houses of Congress. So the Confederates thought that if they could score a victory on Union soil, perhaps the outparty, the Democrats, would sweep in during the midterms. Perhaps they'd hobble Lincoln's war agenda, or maybe they would even invite the Confederacy back into the Union with slavery intact. But that was just one notion that the Confederates had when they made this invasion. They also hoped that they might invite interference from the great powers of Europe, particularly England and France. England and France had been looking on. They were well aware of this Union losing streak. In fact, in kind of secret negotiations between England and France, they concluded that just one more Union loss, and they were going to step in, maybe create some kind of negotiated settlement, maybe even create some kind of permanent division between these warring factions. Now, England found this particularly appealing. You go back only less than 100 years before the Civil War, and the colonists had fought the Revolutionary War. So to England, they were kind of struck by the notion that this upstart nation had grown so ungovernable and so unmanageable, they slipped into fratricidal warfare. And it certainly suited England's geopolitical aims to maybe step in and divide what had been one strong nation on the North American continent into two weakened ones. Mexico also found the notion of two nations where once there had been one extremely appealing. Mexico, rather France, was at the time of the American Civil War, they were actually involved in their own war in Mexico. In fact, Cinco de Mayo, which people often celebrate with a shot of tequila, actually marks May 5th of 1862, when French forces lost at the hands of Mexican forces. Now, the French were marauding through Mexico, intending to plunder the Mexican stores of silver. They wanted to establish a foothold in the New World, and they found very appealing the idea that maybe if they could take over Mexico, that there would be a smaller, a weakened Confederate buffer state above Mexico, and above that, a smaller and diminished Union collection of states. Still another notion the Confederates had when they launched this invasion was that maybe they could flip the state of Maryland into the Confederacy. So it's no accident that this invasion was not only of the Union, but also specifically of Maryland. Maryland was a border state, so it was a state that had stayed in the Union, but had retained the institution of slavery. Several other border states, there was Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. And so a notion the Confederates had was if they could score a victory, not only in Union soil, but in Maryland, perhaps Maryland would flip. This pent-up rebel sympathy would be unleashed, and Maryland would join the Confederacy. Maybe some of the other border states, such as Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, would follow suit. The Confederacy would be that much more enlarged, its opportunities for winning would be that much increased. Still one more idea the Confederates had. They had a lot of notions of what they might accomplish. It was very simple. Score a victory on northern soil, and you're free to range about. We know now that one of their possible next targets was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was a vital rail link where 4 different railroads met. But they would have been free to kind of go wherever they wanted. They could have met as Philadelphia or Baltimore or even the capital. So as you can see, the Confederates had hatched a diabolically clever scheme. And if they could score a victory in Maryland on Union soil, it could redound to their advantage in any number of different ways. However, Old Abe was no slouch, and he had a sly, secret plan of his own. This was the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a document that at this point was in draft form. He had it tucked away in his desk at the White House. It was known only to his cabinet and a few of his very close advisors. And the Emancipation Proclamation is best thought of. Lincoln was a lawyer by training. The Emancipation Proclamation is best thought of as a kind of sly legal document. And its major assertion is it was going to free the slaves in the areas that were still in rebellion. Now you might ask, how could Lincoln have any authority to free slaves in the Confederacy? I mean, wasn't that the whole point of the Civil War, that these two areas had broken in half and were fighting a war? Well, that was kind of the genius of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, was it was an assertion that the South was illegitimate, that he as the Union president, that his authority extended over the land. Now, Lincoln fully expected that if he had the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, it was going to act almost like a beacon. It would lure slaves out of the South and cause them to flee northward to freedom. That in turn was likely to weaken the Confederate war effort. Now, the Confederacy did not include African American soldiers in its army. However, it was entirely dependent on African Americans. It was dependent on slave labor to grow the food that the army ate. It was dependent on slave labor to make the munitions that the army fought with. So if Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation could peel off a number of African Americans who rushed to freedom, then that would in turn weaken the Confederacy. At the same time, the Emancipation Proclamation, as Lincoln conceived it, was going to have a first ever invitation to African Americans to join the Union Army. So that would that much more enlarge the Union and its prospects of winning. However, Lincoln so as you can see, Lincoln had in a way, he'd come up with an answer to the Confederate scheme of invading the North. It was diabolically clever with all these different things that might redound to the South's advantage. But Lincoln had a plan for how it could redound to the North's advantage. However, it was entirely dependent on a Union victory. And that's why that document had been sitting in Lincoln's desk waiting. The Union was in the midst of this long losing streak, and Lincoln full recognized if he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on the heels of another loss, or any Union loss, it was going to seem desperate and illegitimate. Now, I'd mentioned that only a handful of Lincoln's closest associates and members of his cabinet were aware of the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, one person who was aware of it was a man named William Slade. And Slade was an usher at the White House. And he was about the same age as Lincoln. They showed a similar sense of humor. They liked to tell long, folksy, rambling stories. As a consequence, over time, Slade graduated from simply being a White House employee to being a personal friend of the president. Now, and with that new role came new responsibilities. Lincoln was a terrible insomniac, and so often Slade was called upon to keep him company through the night, telling him stories and making jokes. Now, as an African American, naturally, the topic of slavery and how Lincoln was dealing with that thorny issue would often come up in these late night sessions. And Lincoln, of course, revealed to Slade his desire to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And when I was doing my research, I came across an old Slade family lore that indicated that when Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, according to the family lore, Slade had memorized every last word. So now I'll give a brief introduction to something that probably needs no introduction since you're all from around here, but are from here. I'll give you just a brief description of Antietam battlefield, and I'll sort of call out some of the main features that come into play as I briefly describe the battle action. So, the battlefield, the battle happened in front of the city of Sharpsburg in Antietam Valley. It was along about a 3-mile front, north to south. At the northern end of the field, one of the major features was a 40-acre unharvested cornfield that belonged to Farmer Miller. About the middle of the battlefield, one of the main features was a plateau on which sat a little church called the Dunker Church. Also about the middle of the field, a notable feature was about a 1,000-yard sunken road, about 1,000 yards in extent, sunken by wagon wheels over generations, and then sunken further by wind and water erosion. At the southernmost portion of the field, one of the main features was a stone bridge called the Warback Bridge, which I had the pleasure to visit again this afternoon, one of my favorite spots anywhere. The Warback Bridge would come to be known as the Burnside Bridge, named after Ambrose Burnside, one of the generals who oversaw the Union soldiers in that part of the field. And of course, winding through the battlefield was Antietam Creek. Now, the Battle of Antietam, it pitted George McClellan, the Union commander, in charge of 55,000 soldiers, against Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, with 35,000 soldiers in his charge. So as you can see, the Union had about a 2-to-1 numerical advantage. But with someone as wily and aggressive as Robert E. Lee, a numerical advantage could never be taken as an advantage. He was fully capable, had in the past, would again in the future, defeat forces that were larger than his own. Now, one of the things I was really, many of you probably know why this happened, where it happened, and how it happened, but it was something that when I started my research, I was really puzzled by. It seemed something almost preordained about the Battle of Antietam, and I found it really strange when I first started researching. I thought, why was there a 3-mile battlefront and these forces facing each other, across a narrow span before the fighting broke out? And I learned that maybe the best way to think of it is almost like a chess match. McClellan had been pursuing Lee through Maryland, and then Lee chose this piece of ground as an attractive piece of ground, an advantageous piece of ground to make a stand. Then McClellan pulled up in front of him. At that point, you have the two large armies facing one another across a very short distance, and at that point, it was almost like manifest destiny. This big battle became inevitable. Now, Lee, as was his style, was fully prepared to be improvisational. He was going to let McClellan act first, and then he was going to react. And perhaps McClellan would overcommit on some part of the field. That would open up a vulnerability along the Union line that Lee could then exploit. Meanwhile, McClellan, the Union commander, as he was faced up against Lee, and had a little bit of time to think and strategize, McClellan hatched a very simple, on the face of it, 3-part plan. And it goes as follows. He was going to have Union soldiers come down from the north, through that unharvested cornfield, and press the Confederates back onto that plateau where the little Junker Church sits. At the self-same time, Union soldiers were going to cross the Antietam Creek, and they're going to head the opposite direction. They're going to head north And they are also going to press Confederates onto that plateau where the Dunker Church sat. And so it's almost like you almost picture a vice that they were going to try to entrap the Confederates in. When the Confederates were compounded and compacted and confounded, this is when part 3 of McClellan's plan was going to come into play. You might almost think of it as a punch to the nose, a knockout blow. He was going to strike the Confederate center at that point, and that was the battle plan. However, though it be a 3-part plan, in the chaos of battle, with so many moving parts, with so many men, as you'll see as I describe the action briefly here, it was about to all become unglued. So the Battle of Antietam opened at 5:45 in the morning on September 17th of 1862. 5:45 was the official time. It's just designated. That was the very first light. And the action opened, sort of the big portion of the action opened, or the significant beginning of the battle, involved 1,000 Union soldiers, men from New York and Pennsylvania, under the command of a general named Abram DeRee. And they pushed into that cornfield. They didn't know what was going to be on the other side, but they suspected it would be Confederates. And so I'm now going to read a brief passage from my book that describes the inaugural action of the Battle of Antietam. DeRee's line of men stood back up and started for across open meadow to the edge of the cornfield. Here they encountered a wooden zigzag fence designed in the words of local farmers to be cow high, hog low. Too high for a cow to step over, too low for a hog to root over. DeRee's soldiers removed the top rungs of the fencing. They slipped into the corn. They sat out across the field, trying to maintain as straight a line as possible, although the tall corn divided them. Pairs of men, one in front of the other, marched down individual roads. A common feeling was fear. Trembling fingers, legs that quaked so they could scarcely support my weight, a queer choking sensation about the throat. Those are some of the sensations of going into battle as recalled by Civil War soldiers. John Meade Gould, lieutenant with the 10th Maine, noted that, in quotes, "It is terrible to march slowly into danger and see and feel that each second your chance for death is surer than it was the second before. The desire to break loose, to run, to fire, to do something no matter what, rather than to walk, is almost irresistible." A battle line, however, was designed to promote cohesion. Even a soldier overcome by terror was loath to flee, lest he let down his comrades. Some might decide to bolt anyway, but they had to first contend with file closers, best described as a type of human bulldog. File closers were sergeants with menacingly thick builds who marched a few paces to the rear, grimacing and cursing. They relied on their fists and the flats of their muskets to drive deserters back into line. DeRee's men continued through the corn. The regimental flags bobbing above the tall stalks were visible for all to see, making the soldiers' presence and position clear to the enemy. No matter. This type of warcraft, relying on so-called linear tactics, had no place for subtlety. The goal was to overwhelm an opponent with a show of brute manpower. Soon enough, the easily spotted Union battle line fell under rebel cannon fire. Shells exploded in the air above, raining shrapnel onto the men. Solid shot, 12 upon iron balls, struck limestone outcroppings and ricocheted with the loopy physics of some other, more ample dimension, the marbles of giants. Cannon fire punched into the oncoming line, knocking down men and opening gaps. The halt meant certain death, as the rebel artillerists would be able to home in on stationary targets with ruthless accuracy. With shame and file closers to the rear, cannon shell falling all around, the Union line had no choice but to keep moving, uncertain of how far the cornfield extended, unsure of what would await them when they emerged. Maybe it was best not to know. And the reason I wrote maybe it was best not to know was because, unbeknownst to the Union soldiers, at the southern end of the cornfield were about 1,000 Confederate soldiers, about the same number as they had, who had slept the night before in their uniforms, muskets beside them, in full battle formation in a ditch. And now their commander, Colonel Marcellus Douglas, told them to rise up, pick out their own personal corn row, and sort of focus on it, visualize it, and then to kneel back down awaiting further instructions. Just at the moment that the Union soldiers emerged from the corn, Marcellus Douglas shouted, rise up, and suddenly a wall of Confederates appeared. They opened fire on the Union soldiers as they emerged from the corn. Many Union soldiers were killed instantly. Others were badly wounded. Those that could return fire. And the opening sort of big segment of the action of the Battle of Antietam had been inaugurated. And now the Union and Confederate would push one another back and forth through the cornfield. According to one old account I came across, the cornfield changed hands 12 times in the course of the several hours of fighting that happened there. And so even though this was a long episode of fighting, as I said, lasted several hours, and even though there was a terrible amount of bloodshed and men lost, it would prove to be inconclusive. Meanwhile, before it was called for in McClellan's battle plan, a man named William French, general for the Union, leading 5,700 men with 10,000 more men trained behind them, made a turn and struck the Confederate center. As I said, this was before it was called for in the battle plan. Now, for those of you who read various Civil War journals, here is more than 150 years since the battle, and a frequent type of article is an article speculating about why General French made his, quote, wrong turn. And there are many different theories as to why this might have happened. One is that he simply got lost. And if you look at this great painting by James Hope, which is hanging at the Antietam National Gallery at the battlefield over there, you can see the rolling topography, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's altogether possible that someone could get separated from other groups of men. French and his men supposedly were going to join up in sort of the area of the cornfield and sort of clean up the action that was happening there. And instead, they made this turn. So it's possible, given the topography, that they simply got separated. It was a pre-walkie-talkie era. Another possibility that's sometimes speculated on is that maybe French was just freelancing. Maybe he wanted to enact his own battle plan. Maybe he thought he could knock out the Confederate center, that he would seize the glory. It was known to happen in Civil War battles. Another possible notion is that he was receiving some musket fire from the Confederate center, and perhaps he just turned to face his assailants and got drawn into the fight. No one's ever really going to be able to answer this mystery conclusively, but in a way it doesn't matter. McClellan's battle plan, his carefully and simple three-part battle plan, was out the window. At this point, long before it was called for in the plan, the Union had engaged the Confederate center. Now, as I mentioned, one of the main features of the center of the Confederate line was this sunken road about 1,000 yards in extent, and it was now packed with Confederates. They piled stones and pieces of broken fencing in front of it and created a really impressive, formidable bulwark. And now, wave upon wave of Union soldiers tried to dislodge the Confederates from that sunken road. Now, this would also be a several-hour episode of absolutely ferocious fighting, so ferocious that the sunken road would come to be known to posterity as the Bloody Lane. And yet, once again, this portion of the fighting was inconclusive. Now, even as the battle raged, it was possible to get medical care right there on the battlefield. In fact, Clara Bartlett at Antietam, she for the first time realized her long-held ambition to go right to the front lines. She didn't want to wait in the rear and attend to wounded soldiers hours or even days after a battle was over. She wanted to be right in the thick of things. And so she set up in what's called a dressing station. When I did my research, I found dressing stations just terrifying. You had these mobile medical units who would follow the soldiers onto the field, and wherever the fighting would break out, they'd set up a dressing station. And these dressing stations could be incredibly high spots. They could be behind a stand of trees, behind a boulder, in a ditch. Now, one of the things that I learned in the course of our research that I found very kind of intriguing was that both sides, the Union and Confederacy, marked their dressing stations in the same way by raising a red flag. And it seemed puzzling, but then it also kind of made sense. I mean, it was a common nation that had broken up into warring factions, and the medical personnel, they'd gotten their training before the war at the same universities, at the same medical colleges. So it made sense that they picked the same symbol, or the same red banner to fly. Of course, it was caused a great potential for confusion. And, you know, to deal with this, there wasn't any kind of formal treaty or anything. You might think of it almost more like a handshake arrangement, and it went something like this. if one of your boys stumbles into our dressing station, we'll treat him. We're going to treat our own boys first. So Clara Barton, she set up in a dressing station that was on a farmstead, and it was incredibly exposed. There were shells bursting overhead, there were bullets whizzing by. At one point, she was giving a drink of water to a wounded soldier with a canteen, and all of a sudden, she felt a bush in her sleeve, and the next instant, he fell back against her dead. And when she looked, her sleeve had a hole, a bullet hole in it. And so Clara Barton, she decided not to mend that bullet hole. She decided that she would wear that blouse, and that would become kind of part of her casual uniform that she'd wear at subsequent battles. And she kept that, and that bullet hole would serve as a reminder of the terrible toll of warfare. Well, about midday, the Union finally achieved a breakthrough on the southernmost part of the field. They were able to cross the Warback Bridge, across Antietam Creek, and a number of soldiers also forded Antietam Creek. And they were able to get 12,000 soldiers to the other side, a not inconsiderable number. Now, the battle plan at this point was out the window. But given how many soldiers they had, it was still possible to redeem the day. Now, what was going to be required was these soldiers were going to have to climb 3/4 of a mile up a hillside under withering Confederate fire the whole way. But if they could do that, if they could reach the town of Sharpsburg at the top of that hill, then they could cut off what you might think of as the vital exit route for the Confederates back out of Sharpsburg, across the Potomac, and back into the safety of Virginia. So it's still possible for the Union to destroy the Confederacy in time for dinner. Enter A.P. Hill. Now, A.P. Hill was one of Lee's most trusted lieutenants. And A.P. Hill had woken up on this morning 17 miles away at Harper's Ferry. And Lee had woken up on this morning and sent an urgent communique to Hill. And it went something like this. I'm just going to paraphrase. It said, big battle breaking out in the environs around Sharpsburg. Make haste, bring men. So Hill set off for this long march with 2,500 soldiers. Now, Hill, he had red hair, he had a red beard, he liked to wear a red calico shirt on battle days, he kept a ham bone tucked in his breast pocket. It was a good luck charm given him by his mother. He liked to be sort of armed to the teeth. He liked to have, he would have had pistols and holsters, he would have had sort of blades through his belt. He looked a little bit like Yosemite Sam. He would have been on horseback. Now, this was an autumn day from a calendar standpoint, September 17th. It was unseasonably warm. These men were making a 17-mile march, and so as you might imagine, on this unseasonably warm day, there were a lot of stragglers. And Hill was in the habit of ride up behind him, take the flat of his sword, and whack him in the butt to move him along. Well, just as the Union reached the top of that hillside, just as the Union forces reached the top of that hillside, just as they were preparing to enter Sharpsburg, just as they were preparing to cut off that vital exit route back across the Potomac for the Confederates into the safety of Virginia, just at the last possible moment, A.P. Hill arrived, and he and his soldiers drove the Union back down the hill, drove them all the way down to the banks of Antietam Creek. At this point, the sun was starting to set. The Battle of Antietam, which had started at sunrise, lasted for about 12 hours, ended at sunset, and it was inconclusive. From a military standpoint, it was what's known as a tactical draw. However, the next night, Lee took his hard-used army and they crossed the Potomac back into Virginia. And at this point, the invasion of the North was over. And so, though it might be a tactical draw, militarily speaking, it was also an optical victory. And Lincoln seized on these optics to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, the toll was terrible. Antietam stands as the most bloody day in U.S. history. 3,650 men lost their lives that day, according to the official tally. Another 2,000 would die in the days, weeks, and months following the battle. Terrible toll would have been even worse had it not been for a medical innovator who was present at Antietam. That was Jonathan Letterman. I just about said David Letterman. That would have been an anachronism. So Jonathan Letterman, the Union medical director, was present, and he brought with him a number of just world-changing, life-saving innovations. And I'll briefly describe just two of them. One of them was, he brought just a very basic notion of triage. The triage is such a simple concept that's so essential. And Letterman perceived before the battle that this was going to be absolute pandemonium. And after the battle was over, there were going to be soldiers strewn all over the field in all different conditions of injury. And so he impressed upon his surgeons that it was incumbent that they be very selective, and they treat only those men who had some chance of being saved. If a man was a goner, summon a chaplain, give him some morphine to ease his pain, and that had to be that. It was a very cold calculus, but very necessary to saving lives. Another innovation that Letterman brought with him was he brought 200 of a new kind of ambulance. Now, to this point, the Union had made use very often of these ambulances that were almost like wheelbarrows. They had the advantage of being very mobile in a battlefield setting, but also as a wounded soldier was being wheeled from the field to a field hospital, they would be rocked and jostled in these wheelbarrow-like ambulances, and often it would really exacerbate their wounds. In fact, when I did my research, I came across instances in which wounded soldiers actually died on account of being transported in these wheelbarrow ambulances. Well, Letterman, he showed up with 200 new ambulances, and one of their main features was a kind of a rudimentary shock absorber. And so this kind of eased the trip that the soldiers made from the field to the field hospital. It probably diminished a lot of injuries and certainly may have even saved some lives. Now, Letterman, who in subsequent Civil War battles would bring a number of other innovations, he would become known to posterity as the father of battlefield medicine. Another innovative president at Antietam was Alexander Gardner. And Gardner was a photographer. He was an associate of the great Matthew Brady. And Gardner was the official photographer of the Army of the Potomac. So you might almost think of him as being embedded. And he'd just been waiting for the opportunity to document the aftermath of a battle. Why the aftermath? Well, the cameras in this era, because of their long exposure times, they couldn't do a live action shot of something like a battle. It would be indecipherably blurry. So you had to wait till the battle was over to document it. And of course, the Union was in the midst of this losing streak. What happens when you lose a battle? The other side, in this case the Confederacy, holds the field. So Gardner, this Union official with his clunky camera equipment, he had not really had the opportunity to range over a battlefield. With Antietam, all of that changed. He finally had the chance to travel over a battlefield and document the aftermath. Now, he chose as his subject matter dead soldiers. And this makes eminent sense. Dead soldiers don't move, so you're not going to blur your photographs. But also proved to be a very powerful subject matter. Up to this point, when people on the home front had gotten images of warfare, they tended to be illustrations that appeared in places like Harper's and various newspapers. And these illustrations were wildly romanticized. They'd show everyone looked brave, and the generals were standing up straight and tall, and the flag was being held high, and everybody's uniform was neat and clean and orderly. By contrast, Gardner's photographs were so stark. These were terrible images of dead young men. And in a way, Gardner's photographs worked in tandem with the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, was a call to make the war, to invest the war effort with a new and nobler purpose, freeing the slaves. Well, Gardner's photographs, which were very widely distributed in the North, they were for people a first glimpse at what was happening on these faraway fields. They were seeing for the first time the brutality of this warfare, getting to see photographic evidence of it. And with that evidence came a kind of corollary question which dovetailed with the Emancipation Proclamation. If this is what's happening on these faraway fields, if this is how young men are dying, shouldn't this war have a new and nobler purpose? So Lincoln, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. He signed it after what was called a levee. It was a party at the White House. It was a tradition on New Year's Day going all the way back to the administration of George Washington. And they would just throw open the doors of the White House. all the riffraff, everybody off the street could come in. It was a pre-presidential security era. Poor Lincoln stood there for hours, talking to constituents, shaking hands. And so now I'm going to read a brief passage from my book that describes Lincoln actually signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So the White House levee ended around 3 p.m. An exhausted Lincoln repaired to his second floor office where a finalized version of the Emancipation Proclamation awaited him, 5 pages carefully rendered by an official government calligrapher. The president was accompanied by Secretary of State Seward, Seward's son, and 2 other witnesses. On Lincoln's desk lay a steel-tipped pen. It had been promised to abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner as a memento of this historic occasion. The pen was rather worse for wear. Its wooden stem was covered with little pocks and indentations, the result of being gnawed on by Lincoln, a nervous habit. The president dipped the pen in an inkwell. He paused. During the levee, he must have shaken 1,000 hands. His arm felt stiff and numb. If his signature was shaky, he worried, it might appear that he had wavered. It might seem as if he had some compunctions. That's how he put it. The document would be closely scrutinized, of that he was certain. Lincoln, the instrument of Providence, had no compunctions. He had made up his mind. He put pen to paper. He signed his name to the proclamation, bold and true. He looked up at those gathered around his desk and smiled a weary smile. That will do, said Old Abe. And so now I'm going to close by describing, telling you a little bit about this photograph. This is the last photograph, the last sitting portrait ever taken of Lincoln. And it was taken by Alexander Gardner, the person who took that landmark series of images of Antietam. Now, when Gardner took this photograph, when he was developing it, as you can see, it cracked. And that was not an uncommon fate for photographs in this era. The reigning technology at that point, sort of the most attractive technology for cameras were called glass plate negatives. And in the process of developing, frequently a glass plate would crack or even shatter. And what that usually meant was you had a dud. Hopefully you had some other images from the same sitting that you could use. Or maybe you just have to go back to your subject and see if they'd be willing to do a retake. But in this case, Gardner instantly recognized what he had. First of all, this photograph is unrivaled at capturing Lincoln's essential humanity. It's almost as if it sees into his soul. But even the crack, Gardner felt as he was developing it, was kind of serendipitous. I mean, the crack, in one way, it divides the image into two, and yet in another way, the image is unified. And to Gardner, he perceived that it kind of mirrored Lincoln's task during the Civil War of struggling and fighting to hold together this fractured nation. I just wanted to close by saying that Lincoln's bold spirit and the brave spirit of the soldiers that fought at Antietam is still very much with us today. Thank you very much. Yes?
Where did you do most of your research?
I did a lot of research. This is the short answer is the internet, and I'll explain. It wasn't like going to Wikipedia or something. It was unbelievable to see how I would learn about a book. The one that's coming right to my mind, I think it's called Under the Greek Cross, which was by by the colonel who led the Maine regiment that was decimated late in the battle. I would learn about an old book written in 1865 or 1867, or learn about an article that appeared in a journal. I would have it in seconds. It was unbelievable to see how fast you could get. I mean, with Google has all these digitized, whatever one thinks of Google, they digitize a lot of books. And to me, it was outrageous. I mean, I'd be sitting there and reading, and I'd say someone had made a reference. I'd be reading, in fact, one thing would lead to another. I'd see an old article, and someone would say, and according to such and so, colonels, according to Colonel, whoever it might be's account of the Battle of Antietam, I think, I wonder if I could find that. I'd look up, I'd put in the colonel's name, and I'd put in Antietam, and then a book title would come up, and then soon I'd have a book. It was amazing, and you could just look it up on the internet. So to answer your question, a lot of my research on the internet, although I didn't feel like I was cheating, it just made life easier than it would have been years ago, where I would have had to identify all these various archives. I also was able to do those. Interestingly enough, there was a decent number of documents which exist only at the Antietam National Battlefield. So I came down, went to the library, and poked around in those documents. There were also the Ezra Carmen papers, which are divided several places. They have, fortunately for me, they have a number of them at the New York Public Library, where I did a lot of research, and also the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So Ezra Carmen's papers are a requisite. You can't skip those. So I went to the National Archives and also to the New York Public Library. And so that was sort of my main research sort of circuit.
What did you feel like you took away from it, the actual walking of the battlefield?
The walking the battlefield, I can't even, I've got to say that I cannot even imagine, I can't believe how essential it was, is what I was trying to say. I mean, it just, and I would do things like I would do research, and I did my research sort of in the order of the fighting. So I started by diving deep into the cornfield. And so I had this long list of questions. I read over and over again all these different soldiers' accounts, everything I could find. And yet when I got out there, everything, questions were instantly answered, other questions instantly became stupid, other things became obvious, 1,000 new questions rushed into my mind. It's just walking the field was just, it brought everything to life. It was so essential. And I was talking earlier to somebody describing how the very first time that I came down to take one of these tours, I called the bookstore and I thought they were going to think I was crazy. I said, I'm researching right now for my book, just the cornfield section of the battle. Do you have anybody who could give me just an intensive, like an entire morning at the cornfield? I thought they were going to say, that's silly. We could take a 3-hour battlefield tour. They didn't laugh. They're like, oh, you could go with this person, this person, this person. This person would tend to emphasize. They'd be a little bit more emphasis on this. This person. So I ended up doing my battle tours. I would go with different guides who the bookstore had picked out as being sort of the person who's best suited to do each of these different areas, and I would spend more time than that part of the battle action lasted. For instance, I went with Jim Buchanan, who many of you probably know. He took me for my West Woods tour, and the West Woods action lasted anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes, and we spent 5 hours walking over, covering 20 minutes. And I also took a number of other tours, I should mention too. Not only did I broke it up into, certainly made sure that I had a decent grasp of the battlefield action, but I also took a medical tour with Gordy Dahlman here. I took a Footsteps of Lincoln tour with John Schilt there, and I took a tour with a vintage photographer who has vintage equipment, kind of like Gardner had over to do a Gardner tour. Yeah, so that was a long answer. Short answer is I can't even imagine. It's just it was so essential visiting the battlefield, and also it just brought it so vividly to life. And the fact that Antietam National Battlefield is so well preserved, and just really there are places that one could. That's why I went to the Burnside Bridge today. Actually, I thought there are places that if you could wait till a few people clear out, stop looking at their cell phones and everything, whatever they're doing, you could the illusion is there. You're like, yeah, what's here to tell me that it was in 1862, which is just amazing.
Yes. Prior to Antietam, the South had already expressed their displeasure with the North. Did the proclamation enrage them for further activity?
It definitely enraged them, it was certainly met, with all kinds of. I remember when I was doing my research, going across all these editorials, in various Southern newspapers that were, fairly, enraged. It also, initially, part of the reason that Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation just 5 days after Antietam, and then a final proclamation on January 1st, was Lincoln, of course, perceived as also going to enrage certain people in the North to kind of change the tenor of what the war was about. And so part of his notion was that the preliminary would kind of create a cooling off period, give people time to kind of adjust to the idea, and also give him time to kind of And also, of course, the other reason for it, of course, was to give the South its 100-day warning between the preliminary and the final proclamation. And it also served as a kind of a cooling off period. And even after it was official, even after that, I mean, it took a while for certain northern people to come around to that view. So, well, thank you. Any more questions I should ask, or